this is something that I feel is really important, and that is to recognize that the PM role does not have a uniform or even very well defined path for growth, right? It's not something you can just go and take a course on and then bring that back, and it will give you exactly what you need. It's very imprecise matching. And so one thing that I would encourage people to do is, first of all, to do a lot, right? Read a lot, practice a lot, do a lot of projects, do a lot of different things, and see what are the ones that you're good at, what are the ones you really enjoy, what are the ones you maybe do things you haven't done before, right? Like seek out projects that have characteristics that you have not done before, and augment that with a lot of activities around it.
Ciao, io sono Marco Imperato e questo è il podcast di Prodotti. Prodotti è il punto di riferimento in Italia per il product management. Finora abbiamo aiutato oltre 180.000 persone tramite master, formazione in azienda, guide, articoli e meetup. Lo facciamo anche attraverso questo podcast in cui intervisto product leader che spaccano e che lavorano in tutto il mondo. Sono sicuro che ascoltare le loro storie migliorerà il tuo modo di costruire, lanciare e generare impatto attraverso il tuo prodotto. In questo episodio parlo con un amico che è Stefan Schnabl, che è Senior Product Manager in Google, dove lavora da oltre 11 anni. In questo momento Stefan guida il team di ingegneri, il cui obiettivo è quello di portare education su materie tech a milioni di utenti, sia dentro che fuori Google. Stefan scrive anche sul suo blog, che è The Product Insider, lo trovate a theproductinsider.com, dove condivide le sue esperienze aiutandoci a diventare migliori persone e anche migliori product manager. Con Stefan in pratica parliamo di cosa significhi essere un product manager in Google, di come lo è diventato, di come organizza il suo team, degli errori che ha fatto e di tutto quello che ha imparato lavorando nella big tech per eccellenza. Questa interview sarà totalmente in inglese, quindi perdonami per gli errori e buon ascolto. Hello Stefan, welcome to Product Heroes.
Ciao Marco.
Thanks for being here today. We're waiting to hear your story, your experience. So let's start with your personal story. So what's your story? How did you become a PM? Can you tell us something more about that?
Yeah, 100%. So thank you for having me. Super happy to be here. I am actually a first-time college student, and I grew up in a really small town in Austria. And so it wasn't clear at all from the environment what's going to happen here. And folks who know The Sound of Music, the original one, that's actually where I grew up. And always loved math, always loved school for some reason. And then went on to study computer science with a focus on statistics. And always sort of built things, mainly websites, some other multimedia stuff. I could give some examples later. During the summer holidays. So in college, I remember in the summer holidays, I actually started building and selling websites and multimedia CD-ROMs. And that's where I kind of got hooked on building products. And so one summer I worked as a machinist. So on the factory floor, blue overall, dirty, head to toe. I spoke with the owner of the company and they needed a website. And so I told him that stuff that I can do, and he gave me a chance. And I had no clue how to do it, So I went home and I sat in front of my computer until about 3 a.m. to figure out how to meet their requirements. And I finally had the breakthrough moment. So the next day, I was on my Vespa. I didn't have a car at the time. I was on my Vespa. I drove over and I said, "Yeah, I can do it." And I made him an offer, and he took me up on it. He gave me the job. And we made a CD-ROM for their marketing, and I'll never forget that day. I had it factory produced at Sony, and so I went to Sony and had them, do like 1,000 pieces or whatever, and I felt like I've just invented fire. To me, this was so thrilling. And that's when I knew, there's something there that is a source of energy. It was a huge day for me, so I'll never forget that. And so I went on after college to start my career as a computer scientist. I was an engineer in the banking industry, starting in 2008, which was an incredibly crazy time to start in the banking industry. Spent 3 years at Goldman Sachs as an engineer, learned a ton. What I learned at Goldman is really production, to build production worthy products, right? So there's this idea of playing around with stuff, and then this idea of like, this has to work under a lot of conditions. And so I really give a lot of credit to a lot of learnings I had. And then in London, joined Google. We can talk more about that later. And spent 8 years in the Bay Area with Google. And since 2020, I moved back to Europe. I'm currently based out of Munich, and I've changed teams a number of times at Google. And yeah, I'm looking back, and I just couldn't explain why the things happened the way they happened. But certainly, I'm super blessed, and I feel a great degree of gratitude to having had all these opportunities, meeting all these great people.
There are two things that strike me. The first one is that you were driving a Vespa, so we are very proud of it. The second thing is that just if you think that a few years ago you were using not just like producing or selling, we were using CD, and like all the world were using like CD, and now they are kind of gone.
Totally.
So we don't have even something to use the CD for our computer.
Yeah, it's true. I wouldn't be able to look at that product that I built way back when at this point. No CD-ROM drives anymore in any of the computers. It's all in the cloud.
So, and actually, you've been working at Google for 11 years, and everyone is very curious of how to become a PM at Google, because there are some legends around, like hundreds of interviews, like you have to work on some. So can you explain how you personally became a product manager at Google? What was your path?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are multiple paths to become a PM, and then obviously becoming a PM at Google. The one that I took, I called that path getting in and getting around, which is that you enter the organization in a non-PM role, and then you transition to the PM role while you're working for the company. And so I actually started my journey at Google as a researcher in sales. That is an awesome role, has a high degree of freedom, so very creative. You have, a lot of opportunity to generate value directly with customers, which I think was a really unique position for me. And I also happen to have quite a lot of time at my hands. I started in London, as I mentioned, which, is about 8 hours time difference away from Mountain View. So in the mornings, it's pretty quiet. And so I started coding. I started to get to know the organization, the org structure. I did some amazing engagements directly with customers. I had an opportunity to sit down with customers asking all the questions I wanted. And then I learned a lot about digital marketing, which, when I joined, it was certainly already in full swing, but it was still something that people looked at as sort of the new kid on the block when it comes to their marketing mix and investing money and so on and so forth. And having all that time and having that ability and not necessarily having the pressure associated with my role was actually pretty amazing. So it allowed me to take 4 months, 5 months to just totally immerse myself. And then I heard about a product role that opened up. And my manager at the time, his name's Gabriel Hughes. He's an absolute rock star manager, probably, under the very top managers that I ever worked with. He mentored me. He showed me, okay, what do PMs do? And he showed me the ropes a little bit. And so I was, I decided to gun for that role. It was another 7 interviews. So it was fully fledged HR process, even when you are on the inside of Google. It was pretty intimidating. So I'm not going to lie. The people that you get interviewed by are some of the highest caliber individuals. It's obviously a global committee of interviewers. So I studied for 2 weeks nonstop. I put all the other work aside. I sat down in the UK now, in one of our offices in the UK, one of the Google offices, there's a library on the top floor. And I remember sitting there from like 8, 9 in the morning to like 10, 11 at night, just practicing, researching. I remember I had this big booklet, this notebook, and it was sort of like an A4 letter-sized notebook. And it was completely full by the end of those 2 weeks.
What did you study?
I practiced interview questions. So
okay.
I researched interview questions online. And then I just worked through the answers of those interview questions. And I did that by hand because that's a more natural speed for me to acquire knowledge than just looking at slides, right? That's a very shallow way. So I wrote down every single answer. I must have gone through, 200 questions or something. And so it was really something where I felt, you know, like this is almost sort of like you study for a course at university or an exam. That's how I treated it, and it's sort of obviously I turn around now and I contribute a success to it. But the one thing that I do know for sure that it did was it gave me a very clear picture of what PMs do, and that was amazing because when I learned during those 2 weeks what PMs are actually doing, I realized that this could be the role that I could do for longer in my career. And that unlocked a whole new value, a whole new source of motivation for me. I was wondering, I didn't want to stay a researcher in sales. I knew that. I knew I couldn't transition to becoming an engineer. That was just not, I wasn't as technically interested in that at Google. The caliber of engineering is like crazy.
Crazy.
So I was feeling a little like, okay, what's the next thing going to be? And when I learned what PMs do, I was like, oh, this sounds very, very close to, just this feeling that you get that this could be the thing. And so that really carried me through those 2 weeks in terms of my motivation. And then I went through the interviews, and I was honestly like truly lucky. I got the role. It was a role in Mountain View, and I'm not gonna lie to you. Like when I got that role, that was probably the best day of my life so far. I don't remember a day where I felt so thrilled for what's to come than that. But obviously, it's not just a PM role. I moved to Mountain View. I was able
Yeah,
to
yeah.
enter the US and so on. So I'm also a person who loves change. But still, that's kind of how it went for me.
That is crazy to think about, like the Google brand that like force you to study for 2 weeks in order to get a job with them. And while what I see today, especially like in small companies, when you try to hire people like my company, it looks like they don't want to put the work to get through
Mm,
the process. Like we prepare a test, is it 1 hour? It's too much.
mm,
So just in order to make you to feel, comfortable spending these 2 weeks during the process, should be like brainwash about working for Google and how great Google is, and I'm pretty sure he is. So my question is, okay, how does it work at Google? Like a normal week work or the normal day to day? But before that, how was your first day at Google? Do you remember it? Like, how was it? Something different or like?
yeah, the first day at Google. So there's the first day that I started in the UK, and you're going to remember I came from Goldman,
Yeah,
and that's a pretty that they run a pretty tight shift at Goldman. So, and as an engineer at Goldman, I had to be at my desk at 9, and there was coverage. You had to have market coverage, and so there's a lot of sort of process around the role in general. And so when I joined Google, I will never forget that because on my first day, so I came in, and the underground trains in London are notoriously delayed, and there's a lot of people and so on. So I went there. It was one of these days, and so I just ended up late, clogged up behind a lot of people. And I emailed my team and I said, "Hey guys, I'm so sorry. I'm going to be late. I'm going to be like 10 minutes late. So I won't be there at 9. I'll be there at 9:10," which was totally normal behavior in my previous role. It was like, look, I got to be there at a certain time. And if I can't make it, I have to let people know because, they rely on me in some scenarios. And then I had this coworker. Her name's Marina. She's absolutely fantastic. Marina took me aside and told me, like,
what
just
are
that
you
you
doing?
know, it's okay if you come a little late. It's not a problem. And so one thing that was so incredible was just how much we just were empowered or are empowered at Google as employees, right? So really, really that emphasis on, making sure that you can do your best job. and that the company is really, really interested in that. And yeah, that was certainly a new thing for me in that extent. And it took a while for me to break the habit and really understand that, hey, I don't have to email people when I'm late 10 minutes. I'm responsible for it. I'm more responsible for the output of my work, not necessarily where I do it and when I do it. That's something that I can decide myself. And so that was a great transition. But that was my first day, so I was 10 minutes late. I let everyone know that I'm 10 minutes late, and people told me it's cool. It's cool.
So is there a normal week at Google? Because legends say that doesn't work like that, like every other job. So how does it work at Google on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm obviously saying this largely out of a PM perspective. I've only been in that initial role for 6 months or so, and then transitioned into PM very quickly. So from a product manager point of view, it is really true what they say. There is no such thing as a typical week at Google. And so as a PM, you are really, really exposed to a lot of the changes that happen and occur, and you are, for better or worse, you're exposed to them in near real time. So people are considering your role as a role that can be exposed to the change very, 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 very real time, because you're expected to handle change in multiple speed levels, right? So you are expected to be able to digest change in real time, but hand it on in a newly calibrated pace, right? And you're expected to do that well. And not every role is expected to do that, right? There are roles that we would not necessarily take into the fold in as real-time change occurs, but the product role is one that is in that situation largely because we are the ones managing the change, right? And so that does mean that there is just a lot of stuff that's happening that you haven't necessarily accounted for. And good examples for that are always executive presentations, right? I came in one day and my executive presentations got pulled forward by 4 weeks, right? So you come in, you're like, okay, I have this plan for how I'm going to approach this problem, and then you have to adjust that plan in real time, and you have to do it with a smile on your face, and you have to do it in a respectful way, and you're not sort of and I think that part is really unique for product managers. So the only thing that exists is an average week. So as you go and you look over longer time periods, you can say, okay, what happens on average, right? And so on average in a week, you spend a lot of time talking to customers and trying to understand the problem.
Okay.
You go and find out what the problem is, then you go and find out what the problem really is, and then you're going to overlay and dig and dig and dig some more. And so that really is the part that is core of our role, that is core of the PM role, that we're most accountable for, because we spend other people's time. We dedicate resources to certain areas. And so we need to understand the problem side. We need to understand what stakeholders desire and where that overlap is, right? What do people want? What would be helpful to users? Is there an intersection? And is that intersection large enough or significant enough so we can actually go out and make a proposal and put resources against that? I guess that's the main thing that we do. That is also because most projects at Google, luckily, are very well staffed.
Okay.
So, a lot of people that are PMs, they wear different hats. They wear the designer hat, then they wear the little bit of a technical hat in some cases, right? You do a lot of data analyses or that type of stuff. You wear a research hat, problem data gathering and sort of problem investigation stuff. You wear the process hat where you do project management and you chaperone the process to launch. We still do a lot of that, but we mainly manage it because we have staff that is staffed on the projects to handle that. There have been situations in my career where that was not the case. And then my average week would have been, especially when you're more junior, sometimes you work on stuff that is more incubant. Most of that time then goes into one of these sort of auxiliary roles because you just don't happen to have a designer. So if you want wireframes, you're going to make wireframes.
Okay. And do you use any specific framework, flow, or process to talk with customers? Like, can you describe the way in which you're used to talk with them? Obviously, maybe in different phases of the product lifetime.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so we use everything in the range of you know user experience research. I have a UX research blueprint that I apply
Okay.
that is informed. It's referred to internally as rapid research, and I think that term means
Okay.
something even outside of Google. It's a very, very lightweight blueprint to actually create a research brief anchored on hypotheses and have a process to facilitate data gathering with customers in an interview setting. That can be both done remotely or in person, and it can include artifacts or no artifacts depending on where in the product lifecycle you are. And so, that's typically what I default to because it's lightweight, it's flexible enough to be changed. Um, and I have actually written a blog post about it and published it, so it's out there for people that need it. I can share the link with you, and we can
Yeah.
add it to some of the notes.
Thanks.
So that's the main way. But the key thing to me when I do these interviews with customers is at Google, we have the luxury to have a ton of very, very talented resources at our hands, which oftentimes means that those resources are capable of handling being part of these conversations. Meaning, you
Okay.
can bring engineers along, you can bring UX along, you can bring even the project managers along in some cases, and that direct exchange of information rather than compiling the information and handing it over, to me has been a game changer, especially as we embark on new spaces, right? Because then you get the brain power of those individuals. You bring your TL, your tech lead with you, and you have them hear directly from the customer the problem description, which is much, much
Okay.
more impactful than me writing notes and then sharing it back out, which is still valuable, of course, but is more valuable when you have something that is well understood and you just need proof that it is actually legitimately sized or legitimately impactful. But for things we don't know yet, I love to bring the core cross-functional team with me to those interviews.
Okay. So it's more as a like a team play instead of like you getting all the specifics, then pass them through the development team, while you are
Yep.
used to work together, even on the discovery or the research phase.
Full end to end working together is the most impactful thing, because then you have a TL who has the technical acumen and competencies, but also understands the problem of the end user. So the solutions
Okay.
will be way different, right? The solution space, we all know this picture where, that's what the product manager described, that's what the engineer built. It's this swing that is all kinds of crooked and weird and so on. And so you end up in situations where you just don't have that understanding. Now, obviously, if you do not have product management, that's really where companies end up in trouble. So there is still this idea that as a PM, you can summarize things and bring them to the team and explain them, right? But it is a game changer. It has been a game changer for me to bring the cross-functional team along, structure the sessions so that they are still focused and guided. And that's where maybe now, as a PM lead, I'm taking the biggest role. I set guidance around
Okay.
goals and priorities. I set basic guardrails, but I let the team then operate within those guardrails pretty independently, because the engineers need to understand the business problem to actually create something that meets the needs of the end user. And if you're if you're just translating that in sort of generic terms, it's a lot of work, frankly, right? You have to write up a lot of detail to make sure that you don't miss the mark. And secondly, there are things that engineers see that I wouldn't necessarily see, and it is a better solution for it.
Even I think estimation are more accurate because people are directly involved in that discovery process, and maybe they are, especially for engineers, I mean, given my small experience, they are more willing to reduce the scope of what they build instead of building, like something to go to the moon. They just build something just to get through the problem. You don't have to build an aircraft right now.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about like PMing, so being a PM, we are mostly focused, obviously, on Productiros on the positive aspect of being a PM. But before jumping into the proper career, what's in your opinion the biggest thing that people get wrong about being MPM? Because at the beginning, I think like being on the problem side, discovery, teamwork, I mean, they understand that. But what's the biggest thing people get wrong
Yeah,
about
definitely.
being a PM?
So I do a lot of coaching, and obviously people reach out to me a lot about becoming PMs and so on. And I write a blog, which you know, the Product Insider, in which I sort of reflect a lot on these things. And this was an interesting question because I've never actually touched on that question, frankly, or thought about it deeply.
You should write a post.
I would need to write a post about this because that is actually a really, really awesome question to ask. So the thing for me that I sort of came up with as I reflected over this, preparing for our interview here, is that people really only think about the positives. And I think that's expected. You know, people come and they look at the role and they look at everything amazing that's associated with the role, but they really don't see how lonely it is. There's almost never another PM that you closely collaborate with, right? You have a manager who's interested in your career growth, but when you go out and you actually want to build something within a space, you're on your own pretty much, right? It is highly competitive. You fight for scope, for resources, who owns the biggest problem, for example. And that's just very exhausting at times, you know. Moments of success are pretty short. They're over quickly. They're owned by everybody. And, you know, expectations are extremely high. So in other words, you know, it is a job that really, really feels a little bit like, you know, what people maybe describe with feelings that athletes have, right? You know, you're all together, you might all train, but in the end of the day, you're out there doing your thing, you're out there running your race, and you have to deal with the consequences of the results. And in some ways, it does feel like it's all on you. And that's not necessarily always easy. So that's not something that I think is wildly popular or known, but it is something that you do see. And I recently was at a product manager conference in Zurich, where only PMs, or to a large degree, like 80% or whatever, were PMs. And it was amazing. It was a little bit like a therapy session. You went in there and everyone you spoke with had the same challenges that you had. And it was so like, oh my God, finally, whatever I say means something to someone else. Because clearly when you do that in your work environment, again, there aren't many opportunities where you have time at ease, without any pressure, without any competition, where you can actually exchange with another PM what you're just going through. And even just hearing that, hey, what you just went through is normal and that's fine. And that's the emotion you will feel, can't just be such a game changer. And the one thing that I would add to that as well is pairing that up with a brand name like Google really doesn't make things easier. It makes things worse. There's almost no winning scenario, right? You do well, that's what people expect, right? You're a Google PM. Of course you're going to do well. You do poorly, there's a multiplier because you failed as part of this amazing brand called Google, right? So to me, the thing that people get wrong is that they confuse the sort of bigger stuff, like the big brand, the big success, with what really matters as a PM. To me, it's the small things. I'm still most thrilled when we build something that goes well with the users. And that moment where the user sits there and they get something that they didn't think they would get, they didn't think was possible, but it helps them. That moment, that's the moment that you live for as a PM, or at least that I live for as a PM. And I think people have it a little bit upside down when they look at it from the outside.
You know, Stefan, I always say that right now I'm an entrepreneur. I always say that coming from a PM background, that gives you superpower. But at the same time, I've experienced a lot of loneliness. I'm experiencing a lot of loneliness as an entrepreneur. That is very similar to the loneliness I experienced when I was a PM. Like, you are on your own. Yes, you have a lot of people to talk to, but actually at the end of the day, you own your outcome. And so you have to face reality
exactly
at every time. And so speaking about that, you've been working for a lot of time on the product side. Right now you are a manager, and now we'll talk more about that later. But what was your biggest learning as a product guy?
Yeah, that's also something that obviously goes through iteration. So at this stage, this is my answer. In like 3-4 years, I'll have probably a different answer.
Obviously.
My biggest learning so far was what I would refer to as a first principle mindset. So,
Okay.
and this is something that I was always really excited about. I know there are folks out there that are credited with excellence in first principles analyses, first principle thinking. Elon Musk is such a person, for example. So when you talk to Elon Musk about why he went into the car industry, he will tell you all about how he's in the energy industry, and that he's really interested in sort of like how can we make energy mobile and so on. And he breaks it down into that sort of physical, almost like physics level, and I had a moment that obviously wasn't nearly like that, but it still taught me a ton, which was a moment where I got put on a project that was intimidatingly large and was so exposed, and I just quite didn't know, okay, how will this go? And this is now something that's actually been executed already. It was the upgrade from Google Analytics, from what's called Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4. So there's a new version of Google Analytics out, and that version uses different underlying tracking capabilities, a different tracking code than the old version. And so my job was essentially to migrate all these accounts, help 1 million accounts to sort of migrate from the old to the new. And what was really interesting in that context was just the readiness of these accounts. And so there was a metric out there that basically said, hey, most of these accounts are already ready to be migrated. So most of what your job is about is to just create a process by which we can actually execute that migration and update the users that it happened and make sure that they are aware of it at all stages and so on and so forth. And so when I was like, I'm not sure. I multiplied even the slightest chance of failure times the exposure and the significance of this project. And so that risk was still too high for me to just rely on assumptions. And it was just at this point where I was a level 6 PM, which is sort of a senior PM now at Google for a couple of years. And I felt, okay, I really have this craving to kind of, not because I didn't trust people, just because I wanted to kind of go in and really understand, are all the prerequisites met?
Okay.
And so I think the metric said something like 80%. 80% of our, and this is expressed in revenue. So 80% of the revenue that is running through AdWords connected to Google Analytics would be ready for migration, basically. And so I went in and I dissected the metric, and then I dissected the data, and I looked at the real-time data. I looked at the actual data that's coming in from all these accounts, and I looked at the actual underlying tracking that is applied on the data as to generate a real sort of lowest level, first layer information on, okay, where is that data coming from, right? And one thing that became very clear was that the way the metric was defined was not taken into account the need of the configuration. Meaning, it was done in a way that would not translate to the way that we thought about Google Analytics accounts and the data in them. It was made to express the sort of starting point of an account. Basically, an account has started to apply this type of tracking, but wasn't not nearly done with it, right? So it wasn't a metric that measured doneness. It was a metric that measured starting, or that initial step that customers took. So then we shifted the definition of the metric. We said, okay, having started with this is not good enough for our case. We need doneness. We need completeness in the definition of the metric. And then the percentage moved from 80 to 0.03.
It's crazy.
It was crazy, yeah. And look,
crazy.
It was funny because it was something that everyone who was involved in this required the clarity on the explanation from the very lowest layer, rolling it all the way up, explaining the steps in between, so that at each at each breaking point, we could translate what would be needed to move to the next level, right? And that was bypassed because the metrics definition was ambiguous. And so as we resolved the metrics definition and we clearly highlighted these milestones and we said, look, this is the milestone we need, and at this milestone we have this percentage. The milestone that you thought we have, that is at 80, but it's not useful for us. And it was so interesting to see that, of course you can kind of have all kinds of emotions as you go through this, but the main story that you want to tell yourself is that we would have not managed to have any user being successful with a process that we would have conceived. And so in this scenario, we saved a lot of pain, both for the company as well as for the customers. And we then had clarity on articulating concrete actions that were very different from the actions that we thought were necessary, right? At this point, it didn't become a process thing anymore. It became an action that was actually requiring us to enable and support the customers better. And that's what we did. And so the upgrade is now either complete or in full swing, and things are working really well. But this moment was a moment where I returned with this insight to the team. I had a product review. This got presented out, and I had people come up to me and essentially tell me how amazing they felt this was in terms of explaining what is required and also preventing the risk, right? Preventing that scenario from occurring that ultimately our cross-functional team would have been on the hook for, right? And they were very, very grateful. And at that point, they really knew, okay, he's our leader. He's the product lead, right? There was so much trust after that. There was so much goodwill. There was so much positive energy that came from it that you probably could never have achieved otherwise. And so I do think it was definitely a learning for me that it's always worth taking the time, because it did take time. It took 3 to 4 months to do that. We got criticized during that time as well. We had people on the team being asked, like, why are you spending this time on doing this analysis, right? We have this assumption, we have this metric, and we just had to say, look, we just want to double check.
So if you have to explain what first principle mindset is, how would you explain it to someone?
Well, a first principle mindset is very, very simple. It is to verify all the assumptions beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay.
Right? So you have to take everything that you do that is an assumption. And now I'm doing this actually. One of the changes that I made very concretely is every PRD, every artifact that I write, I add the assumptions in the first slides. And I do that because I want to expose what the assumptions are that we build this proposal on. And if someone knows that these assumptions are either risky or just flat out wrong or outdated, they can raise a hand and say that, right? But we need to be the biggest critics of our own assumptions, right? So in that case, this assumption of this 80% readiness was brought to me by, my manager chain, director level. And it's obviously a moment where you wonder, okay, and it's nothing personal, but I felt the assumption is if it is just slightly wrong, the risk multiplier is too significant, and it's not proven. I could not find the definition of the metric to my liking somewhere. I couldn't go somewhere and someone could tell me, oh, this is exactly how it's defined. Here's the formula. So it wasn't proven to me beyond reasonable doubt. So that's why I went after it.
Okay, that's very interesting, because I wanted to move to the next question, but I won't do that because it's too interesting. So how have you managed your manager? Because your manager came to you, okay, this is true. This is true that 80% of accounts are ready. Then for you is an assumption. He has some risks. So I need to, to dig, to understand how to manage this, because you took 3-4 times more in order to get ready to the migration, the transition. I think it shouldn't have been so easy.
No, that's fair. I think that's a really good question. So the first thing is that you're going to have to be transparent. You're going to have to be out there and say, hey, with very respectfully, but you have to carve out a plan and you have to expose that plan. And clearly in some ways, there was certainly some work that, as we did this sort of investigation or this data collection thing, where we collected the data on the lowest level to understand what is the metric as we defined it. That did require some work, but I did something that I knew would be successful, which is I talked to the engineering director. I said, hey, it's your project as well. You have equally vested interest. Here is the definition as I see it. Here is the associated risk as I see it. And I think it is worth investigating what the data is that really comes in, pivoting it with a definition of completeness, which means like that there is a complete readiness for the account, not just, a part of the account, right? But that the whole account is actually ready to be migrated. And he was actually extremely receptive to that, right? Now, if he wouldn't have been receptive to that, that would have been a big problem, because at that point, UX wouldn't really have anything, wasn't really bought or invested much into that layer of the project. But engineer, he got it right away, and he was so supportive. So from an engineering point of view, he was like, "Yep, you got my best engineer on this, right? We're going to do the data tracking. We'll do the aggregation. We'll give you the percentage, right?" He totally understood what I was talking about very, very quickly. And then on the product side, we then had this product review, and I did a pre-review with my manager, and I did a preview with a bunch of other folks. And in that meeting, it became clear that there was a moment where we had a team that would own the readiness, and then our team, which sort of more owned the transition. And there was a bit of a conversation in that product review looking at the data about whether it's credible. And obviously I had the engineering director to back me up on that. And just a sheer gap. That was also good, right? Meaning it wasn't so relevant that it wasn't relevant whether it was 0.03% or 0.3%. It was that it wasn't more than, it wasn't 60% to 80%, exactly, right? It was that it was by magnitudes different. And so then we presented that, and I think we did a job simplifying it. And then we forced the conversation between the person owning the account readiness, right, which was a separate team that owned the sort of tagging that an account would have to go through, and our director. And I think in that point, it became clear that conversation just maybe has never happened or required this level of input to actually occur. And so at that point, it was out in a forum with many directors and stakeholders in the room. And the message was so simple at the time. The message was so summarized and aggregated that it was really, at that point, there was no way anymore that someone could turn around and say, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that," right? So these were the steps. I found allies. I found allies that had power. That's critical, right? That I was lucky there because my engineering director was super bought into it. And then I created a message that was pre-reviewed and so digestible by a broader set of stakeholders that when I was in my review, it became clear that everyone in the room had the same question that I had, which is a simple question, which is, with this type of readiness, what are we going to do, right? And that was at that point, in the ball was in the court of those two folks.
Thank you. So you recently shifted from individual contributor to manager. Congratulations, Stefan.
Thank you.
You deserve it. And so how big is your team? What's the scope? So what would you do right now? And how have you set the organization? So how you get organized? So how many PM engineers?
Yep. So right now I have 4 PMs, and that makes 5 in total with myself included. And we are part of what's called a platforms team. And so the organizational structure in our group is such that we have a single PM Eng UX team that supports a range of lines of business. And those lines of business, in our case, are educational programs. And so they're specifically educational programs which help learners acquire tech skills mostly
Inside
computer
the
science skills.
target is Google or outside? Like is it a
It's
B2C product or
it's inside and outside of Google.
okay.
It is a lot of fun. Obviously, managing and increasing the scope is good. Um, and a lot of folks love education, right? A lot of people have passion for education. A lot of people that I work with, they went through a similar path that I had, which is they grew up, they had some educational success, and then that they feel that got them into the place that they're now. And so they want to share that, they want to enable others, right? And so that makes the space really, really exciting. And tech skills are obviously something that a lot of people would love to acquire, and they are valuable as well because they correlate with impactful jobs, with just impactful things that people could do. And so helping these folks both inside and outside of Google is really an incredible privilege for me, and always really fun. So that's the work structure. From a ratio, we're probably about 1 to 9 at this point, so 1 p.m. on 9 engineers. That's a typical ratio, I would say, across Google. I think the typical ratio in average is between 9 and 11. So you have 1 p.m. on about 9 to 11 engineers. Now, as you grow more senior, that ratio will change. I had been in ratios where it was kind of 1 on 30, but we were part of a team. I had a more junior PM that I collaborated with, and so you overlook parts, you do more, but there's different constellations, I'd say. Yeah, and for us, the main goal is to support these businesses, build tools and technology for them that enables them to increase their reach, go out to students, go out to engineers and adults who want to acquire tech skills.
Okay, and compared to your previous role as an individual contributor, and to me, I was just thinking how crazy it is that, I mean, in Google, you become a manager after a lot of time, after a lot of years, after you are a very seriously serious senior product manager. While in other companies, I mean, talking about Italian companies, even myself, I was managing people like from day one because you're a startup. I don't think is always appropriate, like to manage people when you don't even have the experience to manage yourself.
Hmm.
So it was just my thinking. So, what are the three main changes on your in your day-to-day job compared from your previous role as a
Yeah,
manager right now?
definitely. No. This is a great question, and something that I also reflected upon a lot. There's books out there that are really helpful for this shift. So one of the main things that I would say is that you shift from managing execution to managing goals and priorities. And so the
Okay.
biggest impact is not achieved anymore by you executing something, but by you setting the boundaries by which other people, other PMs can make decisions and essentially create solutions within a specific scope. And you give input on priorities, you give input on impact, and you give input on what scope is most relevant to the company, and you have to give rationale on that as well. You have to not just say, "Hey, as of today, we're working over here." But because you work in this sort of creative problem solving environment, people expect to also understand the reason why we are there, right? So there's a lot of effort actually that comes with that. The second thing I'd say is that people management is really complex. There's a lot around relationships, capabilities, not stretching people too much, but making sure they grow, making sure they feel engaged. And that's probably why Google has such a long sort of trajectory for managers, because we have a lot of people in the company that are obviously at an incredibly high level of competency. And so, when you manage them, when you influence them, when you try to have them focus on a specific problem, for example, a lot of care has to be taken, and that is a justified exchange in some way. Meaning, it's not just that you manage people; people also need to want to be managed by you, right? And with that comes a great responsibility. Um, and then the third thing I'd say is that I have to be way more available and to connect quickly and to be present with my team than I've ever had the need to do before. As in, I want to get airtime with my manager. And so I'm sort of like pinging my manager when I feel I need my manager. But now I'm on the other side of that. And so there's 5 people, 4 people coming to me with the stuff. And then there is also other people who want to talk to me about my team or about the things about the area that my team operates in. So there's quite a lot more emphasis on being available. And there's really no replacement of that. I do think a lot of people feel, remote work, and that's awesome. I love the flexibility myself. But as a PM, FaceTime and quickly being able to quickly connect, being able to quickly influence decisions that someone's making is really, really hard for me to see how that could be replaced. So making good use of team meetings, for example, is something really making good use of that airtime.
Okay, so the last question, actually, there are the 2 last questions. So if you had to leave just one single advice, so just one, to someone who want to become a PM, like who's striving to become a PM, maybe he's not finding the way right now, what would it be?
Yeah, so the summary here that I wanted to say is that, you're going to go out and find something that you can PM, that you can product manage, right? Whatever that is, just anything. And I really think that's critical. It's critical for people to go out, find something that they can PM, that requires them to go to the users, requires them to ask questions, require them to identify the problem, and then find a way to address that problem and go back out with that and really find out whether that's thrilling to them and exciting to them. When you want to become a PM, right, the real question you want to ask yourself is, are you doing it for the right reasons? And if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, you're going to be unhappy, right? Just like in every career. And so the main thing for me that is so clear in hindsight is I went out, I built something, I gave it to my customer, and it was the best day of my life, right? It was so thrilling and it was electrifying. And that's what you need. If you want to spend a lot of time on something, it should be of that significance. And that's what I think people should do when they want to become a PM and wonder about whether it's the right thing for them.
It's a great advice. As you probably know, we train it right now hundreds of new PMs. And by asking them why you want to become a PM, why are you happy when you're a PM? I think the most common answer is the act of building something and make it grow. Understanding customer, building something, I would add, and make it grow. Why? Because you start to thinking about outcomes. So let's say you start to write a blog. That actually is what I did for Prodattiros, is what you're doing right now, just as an hobby probably. But it's very different when you start writing because you enjoy writing something. That's totally different when you start to write and you want to make it grow. Because instead of saying, okay, I'm going to write 10 posts per week, per month, it's like, okay, how can I grow? And so you start to get into this tricky loop about understanding user, solution, problem, all the stuff like that. But if you want to just leave one single advice to someone who's already a PM and want to improve. So someone, let's say, I want to become like Stefan. So starting small as a junior PM, I want to manage, I want to grow. What would it be?
Yeah, this is something that I feel is really important, and that is to recognize that the PM role does not have a uniform or even very well defined path for growth, right? It's not something you can just go and take a course on and then bring that back and it will give you exactly what you need. It's very imprecise matching. And so one thing that I would encourage people to do is, first of all, to do a lot, right? Read a lot, practice a lot, do a lot of projects, do a lot of different things, and see what are the ones that you're good at, what are the ones you really enjoy, what are the ones you maybe do things you haven't done before, right? Like seek out projects that have characteristics that you have not done before, and augment that with a lot of activities around it. And I have one PM that pinged me about a year ago. His name's Benji Soto. Benji is now a PM at Google, but he wasn't. He was a PM at different companies before. And we spoke, I think it's now 7 years ago. Benji called me, he reached out on LinkedIn, and we had a conversation. And it took him 3 years to become a PM at Google and to even meet these sort of requirements as a PM. And what he did was remarkable, is he very deeply looked at his skill set, and he did what's called a skill gap analysis. So he looked at the things that he would need to master so that he would qualify against a certain role profile of a PM. And I do think that that is a very undervalued, maybe because it's boring, I don't know, a very undervalued thing to do is to sit down and mimic a very rigorous feedback process, right? Now we're in luck at Google. We have, we used to have quarterly, then bi-yearly, now yearly feedback cycles. We get feedback pretty constantly from all the people we work with. It's very institutionalized, right? But if you want to make it to the next level and grow as a PM, you can go the approach where you just fire out of all cylinders if you have the time and the capacity to do so. But the more systematic approach would be to sit down and say, what are the skills that are required at my next level? What am I already demonstrating? What am I already good at? And what is the stuff that I'm not yet good at? And try and shine a light on that. And that is difficult because you would likely need someone who has in-depth knowledge of your work. You would likely need someone who's well-intentioned for you, but doesn't necessarily have, any other relationship with you, like a mentor, for example, that works alongside you, but doesn't necessarily operate in the scope that you own. And it's not always easy to come by those individuals. So the best surrogate individual is yourself to say, okay, am I able to do these things? And then find ways to plug these holes. And Benji just did a really incredible job at it because it included changing companies, right? It included leaving his job, going to another company, seeking out projects that he could work on so that he ultimately landed a job at Google. So I was just so impressed with how he structured it in his head. That to me is the thing. It's almost sort of you have to PM your career with the ingredients being the honest feedback about your own skill set and the analyses of the skills required to move to the next level, and then aggressively going after opportunities to acquire and demonstrate those skills and practice them.
Great. So basically, it's framing it as a problem you need to solve in order to get, the outcomes.
Right.
So thank you very much, Stefan. And for who's watching or who's listening to us, if you want to more about Stefan, go to theproductinsider.com. That is Stefan's blog. Or you can add Stefan on LinkedIn. We will put all the links below here on YouTube or on the podcast. So thank you very much, Stefan. We are looking forward to meet you in Italy.
Thank you, Marco. It's great chatting. Take good care.
Ciao.
Yeah?
Ciao.
Bye. Ciao.
Grazie per aver ascoltato questo episodio di Prodotti. Se l'hai trovato utile, iscriviti su YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, insomma, dove ascolti i tuoi podcast normalmente, così non ti perderai neanche un episodio. Prima di andare via, vota con 5 stelline questo podcast o scrivi un commento, una recensione. Questo ci aiuterà a raggiungere sempre più persone e quindi aumentare la diffusione della cultura di prodotto in Italia, che poi è la nostra mission finale. Quindi il podcast è soltanto uno dei tanti modi che Prodotti utilizza per spingere la cultura di prodotti. Trovi maggiori informazioni e tutte le attività che svolgiamo su prodotti.it e soprattutto non perderti l'appuntamento più importante che stiamo spingendo negli ultimi mesi, che è la Product Heroes Conference, che sarà a Milano il 6 ottobre 2023. Anche su questo trovi tutte le info su productheroes.it. Ciao e alla prossima!